I said, it's interesting. We don't have to be certain about sin to do it. But somehow we have to be certain about obedience to do it. I think that our need for certainty is the enemy of obedience.
Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we welcome Clare De Graaf. Clare is a former entrepreneur who built and scaled a manufacturing company, only to have his definition of success completely dismantled by a cancer diagnosis that forced him to confront what he truly believed. After selling his company to a publicly traded company, he made a series of decisions to give away the majority of his wealth, intentionally limiting his lifestyle, and spending the last 4 decades helping start and fund venture capital ministry. He's the author of The 10-Second Rule, a simple but deeply convicting framework for everyday obedience, and his work consistently challenges people to rethink materialism, generosity, and what it actually means to follow Jesus.
Clare, thank you for joining us on the Servant Leadership Podcast.
Thanks, Chris.
I'm so excited. I've had you speak at an event before many years ago, and people still talk about your story. One of the things that they talk about is how you had such a unique business experience, getting involved in business early or starting businesses early, and how you grew something pretty substantial. Can you talk a little bit about your childhood and where your business drive came from, and then maybe a little bit more about what you went on to build?
Yeah, I was raised in a great Christian family. I went to church twice on Sunday, went to Christian schools all of my life, believed the Bible to be true. I had great parents. I tell people the only gripe I have with my parents is I can't blame my dysfunctions on them. They were really nice people, but they were simple people. My dad dropped out of school in 10th grade to join the Navy, World War II. And so he was in the building business. And in the recession of 1957 or 58, I was 10 years old at the time, he went bankrupt and we lost our house. And so we had to go to work for my grandfather in a small machine shop that my grandfather owned with my uncle called Gordon Manufacturing Company. And they just had, 10 employees, something like that. And at the time, they made these screws that made office chairs go up and down. So in the olden days, you had a screw and a nut that you had to adjust to make the chair go up and down. And that's primarily what we made for a number of different manufacturers. But my dad didn't own any part of it at all. And he just worked as a machinist in the factory. But I noticed that they struggled financially, even though they did everything to protect the kids from what they were going through. But they would be sitting there every week trying to figure out how to make $5 work. And I thought to myself, sometime in 7th or 8th grade, I'm going to be rich someday, so I never have to even think about money. And it was kind of a foreign concept to my parents because they're not aggressive or greedy or anything, but I was. And I began to just daydream about having private jet money. I mean, I was, yeah. Oh, yeah. And, I began to shovel driveways and cut grass in the summer and sell things door to door. I did everything I could to earn money. Then I would invest it. I was trading stocks in 10th grade at Merrill Lynch, First Penn & Smith, and just hanging out with all these rich guys. At the time, it was like auditorium seating where you just sat with people and watched the ticker tape quotations come by. And I would just watch these guys and see how did they enter a room? How did they handle a fork when they ate? How did they talk about? how would they dress? I wanted to be just like them. And unfortunately, I did actually become just like them. So I joined Boy Scouts and within 4 years, I was an Eagle Scout. And so I was just the original yuppie before there was actually a term. But I just had these visions of sugar plums dancing in my head. And when I was in 10th grade, my grandfather died. The business was not going all that well. So my dad had a chance to buy the whole business for $10,000, $500 down, because the business wasn't doing all well. But he and my mother She quit her job as a clean lady for the Zondervan family, and she and my mother and he managed to turn the business around and to grow it a little bit, and to where by the time I was in college, we had probably 20 employees, 22 employees, something like that. He was making $25,000 a year, which was beyond his wildest dreams. And so he didn't really want much more. He was very content, but that 25,000 would not get me private jet money. So I had a severe sin issue at the time. I just didn't know it was sin. I just thought it was being all American and kind of capitalism and Dutch work ethic and Calvinist work ethic. So anyway, I began to work in the business part-time, even while I was in high school and college. Got married when I was 19 to my high school sweetheart. We were married for 57 years now. And so my father, I said to my dad, we're never going to get anywhere with this job shop thing, because we could win or lose a contract for half a penny for these screws. And I said, we need a product of our own, like these tilt mechanisms that go underneath the chairs. We provided the screw, but the mechanism underneath the chairs are like $6 or $7, and the screw is 65 cents. So that's where the money is. And he said, well, that's fine, but we don't have a product like that. So when I was a senior at Calvin, I got my first patent on a tilt mechanism that eventually became the largest selling mechanism in North America. But my dad really never lived to see the success of it, because he had lung cancer. He was a smoker and died at 47. And I took over the business while I was still just out of college, and just gave it my all for 10 years. And so by the time I was 31 years old, we had 175 employees, no debt. I was vacationing in Europe weeks at a time, had a cottage in Lake Michigan we paid cash for. And, life was exactly where I wanted it. And then I found out a few days before I was 31 years old that I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the doctor said, you probably won't see your 40th birthday. And that really caused me to begin assessing where I was spiritually, because I knew there were people in church who were really turned on to Jesus in a way that I wasn't. They had these big zippered Bibles, and they were always hugging people and praising the Lord. And I just thought they were like the Eagle Scouts of Christianity. Good for them. I just didn't see the point. I didn't need box seats in heaven. How back can the bleachers be? I was in, And but as the weeks went by, I started to think maybe what they have is the real thing, and what I've been doing is playing at this thing called religion. And maybe that's what it really looks like. So I went to a pastor friend of mine and I said, what do they have that I don't have? They've got a relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, I've heard about that, but how does that happen? He lives in heaven in a galaxy far, far away. How can I get to know him? So he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to read the Bible, read the book of Luke, a chapter a day for the next month. There's 28 chapters in Luke. Come back the next month. But before you do, I want you to pray this prayer every day. God, teach me everything you want me to know, and give me the courage to live it, to obey what you said. And he said, well, come back in a month and tell me what you found out. It didn't take a month. Inside of 2 weeks, the kind of person that Jesus described as one of his followers bore no relationship to me whatsoever. I was the proverbial rich young ruler, just sniffing around the trap, trying to find plan B, a less costly, less intrusive way to follow Jesus than actually obeying Jesus. And of course, there isn't. But I spent 6 months really trying to figure out plan B. And finally, one February morning, I knew that I was about to sign what I now refer to as a blank check to Jesus. And that scared the wits out of me. I've never done that in my life. But I knew that once I signed it, I would depend on Jesus to actually put in the amount. And I no sooner did that than I had an insatiable appetite for Scripture. I began to present what I learned from other business people, and they would get excited about it. And so after about 4 years, my leadership team at the company came to me and said, you own 94% of the company. It's too big for us to buy. We think you ought to sell the company because your head's not in here anymore. All you think about is Jesus. And they were actually right. So at age 1984, 35 years old, I sold the company to a company called Leggett and Platt on the New York Stock Exchange. And so life's been interesting ever since. It's been 40 years, a little 41 years since I sold the company. I didn't plan on living this long. And people said, if you knew you were going to live this long, would you have sold the company? I don't know. I can't say that. But I think God knew the answer to that question. And that's all that really matters.
What a crazy journey. Even so, I have questions about that journey, but even talk about when you sold the company, because most people, when they sell a company, and you had private jet money at this point, you had a lot of money, but you started to realize that money didn't necessarily scratch the itch, if you will. Talk about what that journey was look like selling the company and realizing you don't really have to work anymore.
Well, yeah. So one of the things we did, which was, I still can't believe that we did it, is that it scared me to death because I owned, Wall Street Journal said that I owned 5.1% of a company on the New York Stock Exchange. So we donated the majority of the sales to a foundation to paint ourselves into a corner. So we didn't have all that money available to use on ourselves. So we started a foundation that today still has more net worth than we have. And that foundation we've used to fund what I call venture capital ministry. So we don't write a whole bunch of checks to other 501c3s. The Lord will bring to my wife or I an idea or a person that we really believe in that wants to start this ministry, or it's just a small ministry. And once we decide to help them, we kind of go all in. So I had an office for many years with spare offices and computers. And so we'd let them use our offices, use our copiers, so they didn't have to spend money doing that. And we'd actually pay their salaries for the first couple of years so they could actually do what they're going to do. And we'd kind of get them up and running and then work out a plan over the next 3 to 5 years to exit being financially involved with us. And then we'd pray for God's next assignment. So God has allowed us to begin substantially be involved in 5 or 6 different ministries. And my office did a lot of the back office. So my assistant would register websites. My attorney would handle legal expenses. We'd set up a 501c3 for them. So all the stuff that founders don't know how to do. And so that appealed to my entrepreneurial skills because I like starting things and I knew how to start things. And I could connect with people, but I didn't run most of these ministries. So any of them that were successful, it's because Lord brought me somebody who is incredibly capable, incredibly spiritual, and I just came alongside of them. I was usually the chairman of the board, organized the board and everything else, and then exit after 3 to 5 years. So it appealed to me rather than just writing checks to a bunch of ministries and going to a bunch of banquets and founders, presidents' weekends kind of stuff. So we don't write a lot of checks to other 501c ministries. So that's kept me fresh after all of these years. That as I said, I painted myself into a corner so that we didn't have too much money, and it allowed me to fund a lot of ministries. So I tell people say, "Oh, it's so nice, Claire, you sold your business and you volunteer for the Lord." And I said, "Hey, I get up almost every morning doing exactly what I want, and I've rarely worried about finances. There are people who sacrifice for Jesus. I'm just not one of them." So,
I mean, even that decision that you made to put that money into a foundation is a really big decision, especially when you consider the value there might be higher than your net worth personally. That takes a lot of obedience. And I've heard you talk about obedience. Talk about the journey of how you even got to that point, because people listening to this are probably thinking, you're crazy or you didn't keep enough. And talk about how you got to the point where you felt good about it.
I don't really recall, frankly. My wife and I had only been serious followers of Jesus for like 3 or 4 years at the time. But I noticed that a lot of the guys, successful men in our community who had tons of money, just end up buying condos and places out west and boats, and they could never actually serve in local churches because they're never home. They were gone all winter in Naples and stuff like that. And so I said, that can't be a good thing. I can't imagine that God wants us to have so much money that we can't actually be available for God. That just seems it just didn't make sense to me. So I don't recall ever talking to anybody about this. We just thought it was a pretty good thing. If it all belongs to God, then I don't have the option to use it for myself. I mean, I mean, obviously a certain amount we do. I'll use this example. If we are Christ's ambassador, the question should really be is what does it take to keep my embassy open? And in fact, I gave a talk one time to a group of men up at our golf resort for Focus on the Family. They had about 70 of their big time donors out. And so Jim Daly asked me if I would do the morning talk. And so I said, well, how much is enough? That's the name of my talk. And they just, I just talked about my wife and I set a finish line of how much we wanted to live on and how much net worth we actually needed. And based on Ron Blue's book, Generous Living, and we had heard him talk like 25 years ago. And so I just told him, this is our journey. And when I got done, one of the guys raised his hand and said, well, how in the world can you know how much is enough? I mean, really, with any certainty. And I said, guys, this is not my first rodeo. I mean, all of you guys ran companies or had practices or sit on ministry boards, and I don't think you had any problem figuring out how much is enough for all the people who work for you. But somehow for yourself, this is some unknowable mystery of the universe? Really? And then so one guy said, well, that's easy for you to say because you don't have to work for a living anymore. And I said, I doubt whether there's anybody in this room, except if you work for Focus on Family, who is working for a living anymore. You're working for a lifestyle or just because you enjoy it, but you're not working for a living. So let's not hide behind that skirt. So I never got invited back, and you can tell why.
Well, talk about, I know you have the 10-second rule as something that you developed over time. Talk about how that became a thing.
Well, it wasn't my idea. Actually, a pastor in China ended up in Grand Rapids where I live. And he spoke and he talked about the 10-second rule. And he said, I just noticed how many times I would have this impression to do something good for someone or to keep from doing something I knew was sinful. And if I waited too long, the moment would pass. And I realized what I was doing is I was actually training myself to be disobedient because I noticed that obedience always cost me something, time, money, embarrassment, something. But disobedience saved me all of that, at least in the short run. And so he said, the only way I could train myself to be obedient is to obey the 10-second rule. And I said, what's that? And he said, just do the next thing you're reasonably certain Jesus wants you to do, and don't overthink it. Now, my disclaimer is don't ever use the 10-second rule to decide who you're going to marry, investments, ministries you're going to be involved in. I mean, those take fasting, prayer, good godly counsel, and time. But it's for those everyday pedestrian kinds of things where we sense from God, I ought to actually do this for this person. And then if we don't, the moment usually passes, and we're kind of glad it passes because we can move on with our life. And so I think it's kind of like when Paul says, train yourself in godliness. If I was going to run in the Boston Marathon, I couldn't just read a book about it and with a bag of potato chips laying on a couch. I'd actually have to get up and run. And I might, for the first week, I'd probably only make it around the block. And then the next, but if I did these little things to begin training for it, eventually I might end up running the Boston Marathon. And so I call the 10-second rule obedience for dummies. And it's just a place to begin when you know you've had a habit of saying no to God in little things. Because if we say no to God in little things, why would he ever entrust us for bigger things?
Wow. A lot of people hear that and they might think that's good for somebody else. And they might immediately think of 5 people who they're very close with who need to apply that themselves. And they might not realize how they should apply it. When you encourage people and talk to them, how do you tell them to take the first step? Because it sounds so simple, but yet it's probably hard for a lot of people to actually do that.
Yeah, so I asked them, why wouldn't you take the first step? I mean, if it's something little, that you see somebody struggling on the, you're in your car and they're struggling with something on the side of the road, why wouldn't you stop? If it's a person that you're having trouble in the checkout line at a supermarket and their credit card get bounced, why wouldn't you help them? I mean, if you can. Mm-hmm. And so that's the real question, is that why wouldn't we actually help? Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is because we don't want to be bothered. Mm-hmm. And disobedience has become a habit for most Christians. And the only way to begin to be obedient is to begin being obedient with little things. And as you do, I've had people who have eventually made career choices because they started out just being obedient in little things. And pretty soon they found that they could trust God to provide guidance, wisdom. And so, that's the big thing. I'd ask people, why wouldn't you be obedient? And they say, well, I'm not certain, I said, it's interesting. We don't have to be certain about sin to do it. But somehow we have to be certain about obedience to do it. I think the need for certainty is the enemy of obedience. And I put that statement several times in the book. And so when people say, well, are you sure you get these impressions from God? They're from the Holy Spirit? I said, no, I'm not sure. I wouldn't actually dare stamp thus saith the Lord on anything outside of Scripture. But when we're talking about these little bitty things, let's just say I help somebody with their groceries. How can that not be the will of God? I can't believe someday Jesus is going to say, I can't believe you help those people with groceries. You go to the back of the line. Really? So I just think we should not overthink obedience, and it should just become a habit. It's
interesting. We talk a lot about servant leadership on this podcast. And over the years, I don't think obedience has come up as something that is so important for being a servant leader. But when you
think
talk about
that.
It's so obvious, right?
Yeah.
That's a funny concept. When you think through servant leadership, what lens do you think through? How does obedience tie to it? Or is it just that is being a servant leader, is being obedient?
Well, in some quarters, you'd think of that as an oxymoron, as a servant leader. And but the litmus test I give for servant leadership is, would anyone follow you if they didn't have to? Now, I say that because if you're a general in the Army, you can make people follow you, or otherwise they go to the brig or they get shot or something else. But whether you are in your family or whether you're in a company, would people follow you if they didn't have to, simply because they trust you as a person, and that knowing that you could make a mistake, but that your heart is such that they trust you to make decisions, even if they're wrong, because they trust your motive and they trust your heart. So that to me is the litmus test of a servant leader. And it isn't kind of what they do or don't do kind of thing. It's how you do it, and how do you win the confidence of the people you lead. I one time told a group that I led, we had about 30 staff people, and they were not wild about me stepping in for another president of the organization. I stepped in temporarily. And I could tell they were not happy about it at all. So I gathered all of them together in a lunchroom and said, listen, I want you to give me 60 days to win your confidence. I can't ask you for your confidence because you can't, by an act of the will, have confidence in me. It's my job to earn your confidence. So one guy said, well, how are you going to do that? I said, I have no idea, but I do understand leadership to know that it's my job to win your confidence. Just give me 60 days so that I can help figure this out. I can listen to you, what needs to be done in this organization. And if at the end of that time, we'll take a vote, and if 75% of you don't want me to stay, I'll quit the next day. So the worst that'll happen is I'll be a leader for 60 days. So they said, well, okay. And we got to the end of that time, and I think I got 79%. I just snuck under the wire.
Wow.
But I do understand, I think, what that looks like. And so let's not, this idea of servant leadership, when we talk about Jesus and everything, I understand all of that. But I think it really means, do people trust that you will care for them, that you'll listen to them, that you'll take their opinions seriously, and that you have their good at heart?
Mm. Yeah, I've heard you give a talk on empathy too, and that reminds me of just the importance of leading with empathy in all that you're doing. Well, one of the things that you mentioned to me is that you're going to be coming out with a new book. I would love for you to share what that's about with our audience.
Well, I don't know if anyone's ever going to buy this book. So, because when I did the 10-second rule, I had to self-publish because I couldn't find a publisher. They thought, who in the world knows Clare De Graaf outside of West Michigan? So I could never find one. So
That
after
one
I
did
self,
okay, actually. So
pardon?
that one did pretty good.
It did okay, and because I ended up selling books self-published, and then I ended up getting an offer from Simon and Schuster, and so I sold the book. But so I don't know if this book is even a narrow audience because the title is The Rich Christian's Bible. And in the introduction, I say that you probably may not have noticed, but the title is in quotation marks because there's actually, if God owns everything, there are no rich Christians. We just think we are.
Mm.
And the second part is that they don't have their own Bible. But whether you're rich or poor, each one of us look for verses and stories in the Bible that confirm what we want to believe about ourselves and about life. And we tend to dismiss those inconvenient, costly, pesky verses that would keep us from the kind of life that we want to live. And so every Christian ends up believing their own version of the Bible. And I said, then I've got the same problem because when I write this book, I don't know what I don't know. And so you should test everything that I say against Scripture and not what Clare De Graaf says. So then it goes into, that whole idea of how much is enough and how that affects how we make decisions. In fact, you and I were talking before we started. There was a guy from Indiana. I spoke at a group down there, and one time they asked, how much should Christians give? Is it 10%? Does it include Christian school tuition? Is that just my church? Of that kind of thing. And I said, well, I think you're asking the wrong question. So the question you have to ask is, how much of what you own belongs to God and how much belongs to you?
Mm.
And he said, well, why does that matter? And I said, well, if it all belongs to God, then the only question is, what is he going to allow you to live on to manage his resources? I said, I've got a really close friend who manages billions of dollars for a wealthy family here in West Michigan. And if you ever went to them and said, how much of all the money you've given me to invest do you want back? They would know to laugh or cry over that. It was, I want it all back. The only question is, what are we going to pay you to manage our money and to keep our office open? And so I said, maybe that for some people that they literally have to give away 90% because it'd be bad stewardship to even keep 10. Mm. So I think we're just asking the wrong question. So I get into that in the book, but it's just so counterintuitive because evangelical Christianity in the West is some dangerous amalgam of Bible doctrine, church tradition, Calvinist work ethic, capitalism, democracy, where we actually think we're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Jesus actually didn't promise any of that.
Mm.
He just asked us to work for that on behalf of other people, not ourselves. And but that whole idea is like, whoa, what are you talking about? Well, actually, I think I'm talking about what Jesus is talking about. So now I'm an imperfect practitioner of it, so I'm better off in theory. I have the same problem everybody does. I like nice things. And so how many times have I violated my own rule? Too many times, but it has been something that I've had to think about and taught other people to think about because I'm confident it's true. If it all belongs to God and we are his trustees, then the only question is, what will he allow me to keep for my lifestyle, and all the rest should be returned to him and not after we're dead. I'm not sure we actually get credit for leaving money after we're gone because it requires no sacrifice. David, when when he was looking for an altar and the guy offered to give it to him, and he said, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to give God something that cost me nothing. And the widow and the pennies and the rich guy, and Jesus said she gave away more than the guy with a ton of money. So I'm not sure we get any credit for money we leave after we die, unless it's just that we died unexpectedly or prematurely or something. But I think that Jesus is also very concerned about, if it all belongs to me, are you making it available to me in your lifetime when it's inconvenient for you, when you might have to say no to yourself?
Wow. How does somebody even take that and do something with it? Because a lot of people might feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they're saving, but they've got a savings fund and they need to save as much as they can because they're young and they're in their 30s or their 40s and don't know what the future has in store.
Yeah, there's a local guy who's a realtor. And about 20 years ago, I kind of gave this talk to a group of people. And so he and his wife decided, what would it take to make a really good living? And at the time, they said, if we ever made $70,000 a year, that would be amazing. So they set a budget themselves and said, everything over $70,000 a year, and they indexed it every year for inflation, they were going to give away 50% of anything over 70%. 70,000.
Hmm.
Well, about 4 years ago, I talked to him, and he was making like $450,000, and their budget was now like 180,000 with inflation and everything else. But they were giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars because when they didn't have money, they set a finish line. And so everyone thinks that's a good idea, but if you don't set it now, when you're in your earning thing, it's very difficult because there's no alarm bell that goes off, you've got enough. Because we watch programs like Fixer Upper and we see these really nice houses and they're very cool. My wife says, how come we can't remodel our kitchen for $1.45 like they can? Or, and you learn to get nicer and nicer things. And so as your income grows, your appetite for more and more grows. And so I urge younger people to set a finish line for how much they need to live on and index that for inflation and pledge what they're going to do beyond that. I also have a lawyer friend who, when he got out of law school, decided to start giving away 5% a year and increase that by 1% a year. It's been 46 years. He's given away over half his income because it only went up 1% a year. The guy's incredibly generous. He just cuts a check right out of his firm's account every single month. And he said, I end up with tons of money in this giving account that I would never have had the discipline to do. So there are ways you can actually begin doing this before you have a company that you're going to sell. And in fact, sometimes when I'm giving these talks, I'll occasionally get a group of young entrepreneurs and business guys, and I'll say, I know exactly what you're thinking. I'm going to do what Clare did. I'm going to work my butt off, make a ton of money, and then I'll donate my time and a lot of the money to God. And I said, that's like making a decision. You're going to binge drink in college for 4 years and then stop when you get done. Materialism is an addiction. And I said, I know I'm a recovering materialist myself. So don't consider that. That is not a plan. That's a plan for failure, because there are very few people who, once they make a ton of money, have the discipline to say no. So
Wow.
anyway,
This is so good. Claire, I want to finish the last minute with 10 rapid fire questions where you
okay.
just say the first thing that comes to mind and there's no wrong answer.
Okay. Is this like a Rorschach test for
Yeah, maybe there's a wrong answer.
psychologists or something? Okay.
Who's the first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
Wow. I would have to say a guy like David Green at Hobby Lobby. Here's a guy that has all the resources in the world. In fact, one time I saw him in O'Hare Airport. He had missed a flight, and he had a whole bunch of luggage, and his wife was sitting on the luggage in O'Hare Airport. And I came up to him and I said, "It's right now with our NetJet brochure would come in really handy, would it?" He said, "Oh yeah, for sure." But they've decided that they're going to live simply, and they didn't at the time. They didn't own a corporate jet not because they couldn't afford it, but they just said, "No, we're not going to spend money that way." I consider him a servant leader.
That's good. 5 words that most describe you.
A would-be follower of Jesus. When I say would-be, some days I'm better at it than others, and other days I want to hide all sharp objects. So
All right. Favorite book or author?
Well, obviously got to say the Bible if you're a Christian, but other than that, I really appreciated How Then Shall We Live by Francis Schaeffer, and Kingdom and Conflict by Colson. Are wonderful books that help us shape a biblical worldview. Because a worldview is the sum total of everything you believe to be true, whether it is or not. I mean, there's things that I believe that aren't actually true. And so the more we actually study Scripture, we get closer to a biblical worldview than Claire's worldview.
Yeah. All right. Favorite food?
Oh, pizza.
All right. Favorite thing to do in your free time?
I do long distance sea doing. So we have a cottage in Lake Michigan, and I'll go 300, 400 miles over a couple of days on Lake Michigan with some friends. We call ourselves the Wet Wild Hogs. Now I'm getting a little long in the tooth for that now, so I don't go quite those same distances anymore, but I love to go 100 miles, 150 miles in a morning or afternoon and have lunch, and so that's my way of recreation. I like to ski.
Wow. I was going to ask surprising fact about you, but those are pretty good facts. Where's your favorite place you've been?
Oh, I'd say Switzerland. It's just amazing.
Anywhere in the world that you wanted to go or want to go that you have not been to yet?
Yeah, New Zealand. It's just too far.
All right. Best advice you've ever received?
I once, as a young man, I was just a new Christian. I went to a Christian conference, and I forget the guy, but he's a patriarch in the Christian world. I mean, this guy's written a bunch of books and everything. His name eludes me. And I said, "Do you have any advice for a young man?" And he said, "The 3 G's." I said, "What is that?" He said, "Keep your hands off the gold, the glory, and the girls."
That's good advice.
And I've taught my grandsons that same thing.
That's good. I should teach my boys that. I like that. All right. And finally, we talk a lot about servant leadership on this podcast. Why do you think, and I know you shared this a little bit, but why do you think it's important for people to learn more about being better servant leaders?
Because Jesus taught that. And I mean, the whole New Testament is about serving others. So it's not optional for us to study. It's what Jesus actually expects of Christians. And so I think we need to get serious about what does that look for me and what does that look like for other people and how can I learn from it? Because the alternative is we just serve on a bunch of boards, we volunteer and do kinds of things. And I think what it means to be a servant leader is that Jesus owns you 24/7. And going to church on Sunday, doing a Bible study on Tuesday morning with a bunch of men, volunteering on Wednesday night is an obedience we can schedule into our busy lives. but Jesus expects us to be available all the time. And those are nice activities to do. But we need to actually wake up every morning and ask Jesus, make me aware of what your assignment is for me today. Even if I don't know that, give me radar for people who need help. Give me radar for people who don't know you, that I need to explain who you are to them. And so it's just being vigilant all the time and not falling into just being a religious Christian.
Wow.
And there's some days I'm better at that than others. So that's my disclaimer. My family can tell you that.
Well, thank you so much for being on our podcast. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I'm excited to read the book whenever it comes out. And thank you just for the blessing you've been to so many men across the country, because I know you do a lot for all of us.
Well, thank you, Chris. I've had a great time. It's great to get to know you. And anytime you want me back, I'm happy to do it.
All right. We'll talk
I'd
soon.
be honored. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.